Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Sunday service. Happy May. It's May 1st. When I was a kid, my mom enjoyed May Day. And I don't know if any of you ever did this, but my mom and I would make little paper baskets and put like flowers in it or little leftover Easter candy or something like that. And then we'd go around the neighborhood, and my mom would have me go up on the doorstep of our neighbor's house and ring the doorbell and then go run and hide behind the bushes so that when they open the door, there'd just be a little basket there. I don't really know where that comes from, but it's a good memory of mine. Anyway, happy May. So my topic for today is called Grace in God's Calling. And I had this topic in mind, but then I was looking for some Bible quote that matched it. And actually, I feel like I found the Bible story or the Bible verses that this whole concept comes out of. So I want to share from Romans chapter 8. This is after Jesus' death, as Christianity was under persecution, but it was spreading surely and steadily. Paul wrote this letter to the early Christians in Rome. And it was a letter to people who were young in their faith, but growing in their faith, and it was to encourage them in their faith. So I feel like it could be written to me. I'm young in my faith, growing in my faith, but I get a lot of encouragement from it as well, and I can relate to a lot of the sentiments. So I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but I'm going to take a lot of the key quotes from this chapter in Romans 8. Those who live according to the flesh have their minds set on what the flesh desires. But those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their minds set on what the Spirit desires. The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. But if Christ is in you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness. And if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his Spirit who lives in you. For those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. So, I actually want to go back to last couple verses there. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. Those he predestined, he called. Those he called, he justified. Those he justified, he glorified. So for for myself, I feel very fortunate that I feel I know what God's calling is for my life. And I find that my purpose, like God has a purpose in my calling, and that there's a resonance there. I realized what my purpose was about 10 years ago. And it wasn't, I've been in situations where you're supposed to come up with like a mission statement, and you're given a set amount of time to like think about your priorities and your goals and put a mission statement together. And that wasn't what this was. For me, this was like a welling up of what was already inside, but I didn't recognize before. And for me, I discovered that my purpose is to create a truly loving family where love is tangible and it's free-flowing between my husband and myself, between us and our kids, the kids with each other, and that it is so abundant that it overflows and it embraces and draws in people around us. And it's pretty simple. And you might think that being a pastor would be my purpose, or now I'm running a school, that would be my purpose. But actually, I find that those are also callings, but they actually only support my purpose. They're just like a manifestation of my purpose on different levels. Right now, this calling is manifesting in the school that we've been developing over the past couple of years. I have to say, it has been one of the most challenging years of my life. I'm doing things I have never thought I would be doing. I've told Mike, I think I'm further out of my comfort zone than I have been. And I was like, since when? Since having the twins? In some ways, that felt more natural. This is really out of my comfort zone. And in so many ways, throughout the past year especially, I've felt the inadequacy of my own personal abilities or skills or knowledge. But I also feel that it's a calling from God, and that God is working through me and through this school to do something greater. So I have seen firsthand how God is equipping me, or God is justifying me. God has called me, he's justified. I don't know if I'm glorified, but God is definitely interceding on my behalf. So I feel this very strongly in my own life. And actually, this past week was a GPA workshop, Generation Peace Academy. They're having their April workshop up in Estes Park. It's absolutely beautiful. And Mike and I were invited to give a testimony about our blessing and our marriage to these young people who are starting to think about, maybe getting blessed or married someday. And we didn't have a whole lot of time to prepare for our testimony. Actually, we did. Never mind. I'll take that back. We were told about it several weeks before. We just didn't actually prepare for it until a few minutes beforehand. But I realized that actually the testimony of our marriage and our blessing, if you were to just look at our marriage and blessing, it's a short testimony if you just talk about the story of it. But actually, God has been working in both of our lives since way before we ever knew each other. Preparing us, giving us certain experiences in our life, equipping us into our marriage, and since then, just in so many different ways in our life. Mike and I like to say that when we became pastors, we thought it was our choice. Nobody appointed us as pastors. We did it. We prayed about it. We applied. We interviewed. So we like to say, well, we thought it was our choice. But actually, we see in so many ways that God was guiding us this way the whole time, and we just managed to not fall off the path. We managed to choose to stay on the path, but in so many ways, God has called us to something, and he's guiding us in that way, even though we haven't always known exactly where we were going or how we were going to get there. So I think that we don't, anyway, you yourself might be able to relate to some of that in your own life. I think that God calls us in many different ways for his purpose. I think that God's purpose is absolute, eternal, and unchanging, but that each one of us is an individual embodiment of God's truth. And we're all unique. So we each have our own part to play. We're each like a piece of the puzzle. So when I'm talking about my story, it doesn't mean that that should be your story. But I think that probably many of you have had an experience where you have recognized that God was calling you to something or preparing you for something, even if you didn't know exactly what it is. And really, we don't know the details of the plans that God has for us. I think about back to when I was a kid. I never could have guessed when I was a struggling middle schooler what God had in store for me. I never could have guessed when I was on my gap year missions program. I had some ideas. I was learning more about God. I was learning about God's purpose. I was learning about purpose of God's creation and restoration and divine principle and like putting together some ideas of how that might work in my life, but I really could never have guessed where I would be now. Even at the time of our blessing in marriage. Honestly, even a year ago, I wouldn't know what God had in store for me today. So we really don't know the details. And I'm actually very curious about what's next. Who knows? But I really love this quote in Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. I really resonate with this quote. And I think I have heard this quote many times in my life. And I think when I was younger and I heard it, I'd be like, I hope so. I hope he does. But I couldn't see it at that time. I didn't have experiences that confirmed to me that God has a plan for me and he's moving me in that direction. I can confidently say now that I know God has a plan for me and he has given me a hope and a future and he's working actively to get me there. Just this past few weeks, actually, in our school, we had a visit from the fire department recently. They come every 6 months to make sure that we're all up to code with our fire extinguishers, exit signs, those kind of things. Routine. But we were in session in school, and there's kids running all around, and he was talking to Mike, because I do have a alarm system. Like, no, never needed that before. He was like, well, you might need it with a school. So that kind of made us a little nervous of what we might have to invest into later. But then beyond that, actually a different guy from the fire department came by the next week, and he said, I heard you have a preschool here. I'll need to see your childcare license. And I was like, what? And I think I was able to get out of it because really the kids who are in our preschool program are just the children of the parents who are staffing at the school. But it hadn't even occurred to me that might be something that we actually need, especially if we want to grow and we want to develop. And I felt really oblivious, again, felt really unqualified, inadequate. unprepared. Actually, I really don't like to not do things the right way. So my mind automatically went to, oh my gosh, I'm a bad person. Am I breaking the law? What am I doing? You know? But so I started to look into what would it take to, if we want to develop this program, then we'd need to have a child care license. There's like so many requirements that I had no confidence to fulfill. So I felt a huge block, actually. As I'm trying to finish up the school year on a strong note and get ramped up and excited for next year, I actually felt kind of deflated about what the next year might look like. But, and I wasn't attached to the outcome, but the way has opened. I'm not exactly sure how it will look yet, but actually I felt God was really using this obstacle to move us in a little bit different direction, a better direction, to actually create a real preschool that can really welcome many people and prepare them from a very young age to own their life, own their education, own their faith, and own their relationships. So that just opened up for me yesterday. I'm so super grateful. And again, it was just like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I really don't know what I'm doing most of the time. All I know is that I made a commitment that God called me to. I know God called me to it. I committed to it, and I'm doing what I can with my limited abilities, my limited knowledge, with all my inadequacies, and God is interceding for me. This is where I feel God's grace in my life. This is another from Romans. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for. We're told to pray many times, but sometimes we don't even know what we're doing. We don't know what we're supposed to pray for. But I really think that if we're working in God's purpose, if we're really doing our best to follow God's calling for our life, God will intercede on our behalf. The Spirit intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. So, I have not been on track my whole life. I like to say that I know what God's calling for me is, and I'm committed to that calling. But in reality, I'm not thinking about that 100% of the time. There have been times when I've wallowed in my misery, when I've refused the call, when I know what God's calling for me is, and I'm just like, maybe not today, God. There's times when I'm more focused on what others thought of me than on what God thinks of me. Even this year, even in the past week, there are times when my focus isn't laser sharp, it gets blurry, and I get whiny. Maybe not so much out loud, but doesn't mean it's not happening in my head. But this is where I really feel God's grace. God knows our heart, God knows our commitment, and in those times when we're maybe dipping or straying a bit, I think God gives us grace for his purpose. So I wanted to talk about this a little bit because grace is a really big word in the Christian realm. And I think it's something that us as unificationists actually don't talk about that much. But God's grace is so beautiful and unconditional, and experiencing that grace is really enough to change your life. I always come back, I just love this scene in Les Miserables, the older one, not the old one, the older one with Liam Neeson, and he he finally gets out of prison because he stole a piece of bread all those years ago. And he's miserable and he's destitute and he's just like surviving at the bottom of the barrel kind of existence. And a priest takes him in and invites him in for the night, goes to bed, and he looks around and he sees silver candlesticks and silverware and things, and he's not thinking from a higher self. He's just in survival mode, so he just starts to take it. And then the priest wakes up, hears him, and confronts him, and he smacks him over the head, right? And runs away. And so the servants call the police, and the police catch him and bring him back. And he already knows he's going back to prison probably for the rest of his life, right? That's what is just in this situation. And that's what he deserves. But the priest says to him, the police come in there, like, is this the man who do you recognize this man? He's like, oh yes, he was my guest last night. My son, if I'd known you were leaving, I would have given you the silverware too, And so the police can't say anything because the priest won't accuse him. And Jean Valjean, he's just overcome with an experience of grace, knowing what he deserves, but instead experiencing God's grace. So grace is huge. But I think that what maybe the Christian world doesn't emphasize so much is that God gives grace towards a purpose, not just to incessantly forgive and forgive and forgive so that we can continue to trespass his heart and take more and more and be forgiven again, right? The priest gave Jean Valjean grace because he could see that there was goodness in him that he believed in, that he believed would manifest in his life, and it did, right? He turned his whole life around because of it. So in the same way, I believe that God gives us grace for a purpose. And that there's a lot more of it, we experience it. Not that it isn't there all the time, but we're more open to it when we're working in God's purpose. When we're thinking about what God is trying to do in my life. When I am trying, despite all my limitations and my inadequacies, when I'm doing my best to live God's purpose in my life, God fills in those spaces where we don't have enough skill or enough knowledge or enough love. But God sees our heart, and God's grace is there to fill in the gaps. This is how I many times experience grace in my life. So, for some of you, though, maybe this isn't so relatable, and I definitely can relate with that as well. It's okay if you don't know what your calling is yet. Some people know what their calling is from a very young age. There are children who get it in their minds, and they know, I am called to be a vet. And you're like, okay, you love animals, sure, that's great. But really, they're called to be a vet. And they grow up and their whole life is invested in it, and they become an amazing veterinarian. But there are many people who don't know what that looks like for them yet. I'm not just talking about a career. It can be in a career, but your calling. Some people, it's much later. I was just thinking about my grandfather. My dad's father, went to the military, got married, started a family. I'm actually not sure what he was doing at that point, but he had an uncle who I think was injured, and his back was so painful. He couldn't sit, and he couldn't lie down. He could only stand and not be in pain. So he's tried to sleep standing up. And it was so painful and so miserable, and the doctors couldn't do anything to help him. And then a chiropractor, he visited a chiropractor for several visits, fixed his back completely pain-free, and my grandfather saw this and thought, it was like a calling, like, wow, if I can do that for people, I can help so many people who don't know about this. Because back then, that was in the late 30s, early 40s maybe. Nobody really knew that much about chiropractic care back then. But he was like, I want to do this. And so he packed up his family, moved to one of the only chiropractic colleges, maybe the only one in America, and went through all of the training and all of the schooling and got his degree, and then moved down to Southeast Missouri in the middle of nowhere. He was the only chiropractor in probably like a 500-mile radius. Nobody even knew what one was. But he knew that was his calling, and that's where his life's purpose was. So I never got to meet my grandfather, but I grew up in that town where he was a chiropractor. And as a kid, I still met so many older people who said, "Oh, you're Doc Brady's." Well, they thought the really old ladies thought I was his wife because they had dementia. "You're Doc Brady's wife." And then some people thought I was his daughter, and some people thought I was his granddaughter. But everybody in that town who is over 75 knows Doc Brady, He shaped the whole community. So, but he didn't get that calling until much later in his life. So there's not a time that you need to know by, but I think it's important to be looking for what it is that God wants to do in your life, and to be able to reflect on your life and to see where God has been working so far. Sometimes God has been doing a lot in our life, but we don't necessarily recognize it unless we look for it. Now, when I look back, I can see so many ways God has been maneuvering me to prepare me for where I'm at today. But I didn't see it then. So my calling is continually evolving and taking on new forms, but it hasn't changed. Here's one more recap from Romans. Those who live according to the flesh have their minds set on what the flesh desires, but those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their minds set on what the Spirit desires. The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. And this is something that I was reflecting on, that I had wished I'd shared during our testimony to these GPA kids up in Estes Park. Some people, sometimes I myself, look at my life and be like, this is a lot of work. There's a lot of daily effort. The days can be hard. I have a lot of friends who, if I follow them on Instagram or on Facebook, I'm somewhat jealous of their travels and their restaurant outings and their financial or educational accomplishments. I don't have a whole lot of those to brag about. The days can seem mundane, or they can seem hard sometimes. But I really feel that despite the difficulty and the challenges of trying to follow my calling daily, when I stop, or when I just pause and reflect, all I'm really left with is a feeling of gratitude and of fullness and of purpose and happiness. It can be the opposite for many people. Many people are trying to fill their days with happiness. So they're looking for the social media attention, or they're traveling to get the stimulation of new places and new things and meeting new people and new relationships. They want to meet new people and or get that next accomplishment, the next financial level of financial freedom. But I know many of those people, and many of those people, when they stop or when they pause, it's actually lonely and empty. So I feel like that's a huge difference. Not that purpose-filled people can't enjoy those things. When those things come along, I enjoy them very much. But I'm not chasing those things. Those are nice additions to my life of purpose. So I felt that related very much to this. Those who live according to the flesh have their mindset on what the flesh desires. But the mind governed by the flesh is death. And it's not a physical death. It's a being dead inside. But the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. So, and I have a couple of quotes from Reverend Moon that I feel went very well with this. When do we meet God? Not just anywhere, but only on the front line. And when I was on my gap year program, and I was fundraising all the time or witnessing all the time, we called that the front line, when you're like actively doing God's work. But I realized that the front line can be found every day in your daily life when you're actively doing God's work in your family or in your relationships, in your calling. So we meet God when we're following our calling. You will experience that. If an individual tries to live for himself, then God never comes to him. We don't experience God. We might like to feel God's love, but we don't find it when we're trying to live for ourselves. But once he sacrifices himself for the family, God will come. You will discover that when you are not working for yourself, God will come and do the work for you. So again, God's interceding for us. And lastly, happiness is only temporary and small unless God resides in it. So my message today is to really encourage you that each one of you is an individual embodiment of God. God lives in you in a way that God doesn't exist or live in any other person on this earth. So, no matter who you are in your life experience or how much experience you have or how inadequate you might feel, because you are a reflection of God that nobody else can reflect, God has a calling for you. There is no way around that. So our question then is, how can I come into resonance with that? How can I find it? How can I move? If I don't know what it is, how can I move towards finding that calling? What changes do I need to make in my life to resonate with God more so that God can guide me more freely? And sometimes that might look like giving up something for a while, or making a sacrifice, or maybe not having the Instagram beautiful life. But that's where true happiness comes in, and it lasts beyond the ups and the downs and the difficulties or the highs or the lows, whatever. I really feel that when I am living in my purpose, when I know I'm active, when I'm there and I'm actively moving forward in it, then even when it's hard, I feel joy. And that those challenges are not the kind of challenges that I might be scared of them, I might not enjoy them thoroughly, but I'm still excited for them. because I know that there's a blessing on the other side. That was my main message at the GPA workshop. I was like, don't shy away from challenges. When we go through the challenge, there's always a lesson. There's always, if it's not a victory, it's a lesson, and God is working through that. So go through our challenges, believe that God's guiding us, interceding for us, moving us towards our purpose, which is connected to his purpose. And there's so much grace in that purpose. So please join me in prayer. Heavenly Parent, thank you so much for this beautiful Sunday morning and for each person who could be here today. God, I know that you are so entranced by your children. You are so in love with each one of us. And you are so excited to be a part of our life if we let you, if we open up our hearts, if we welcome you in. God, I pray that even though we are all coming from different places and we might be going different directions, I pray that you can be guiding each one of us on our path towards your purpose, Heavenly Parent. I pray that we can make conscious efforts to choose you every day, to choose you and your purpose and your true love over the instant gratification or the bright and shiny objects that might distract us daily. I pray that we can continue to choose you, because when we do that, we then surrender our lives to you in each choice, and we allow you to guide us. We allow you to move us forward, even when we don't know where we're exactly going, or even if we do know our goal, we don't know how to get there. But God, you have a path. You can open the way for us. So I just pray that we can continually search for your guidance in our life. We can be humble to you. We can love you with all of our strength and all of our soul and all of our might. And I want to just offer this service to you, this time to you. I pray we can take today to reflect on how you've been working in our life and be open to where you might be leading us next. And I offer this prayer in my name, Mike Landonia Hendrick of Blessed Angel Family. Amen and adieu. Okay, thank you.